Okay, I'd like to begin the meeting and welcome everyone. So good afternoon and welcome to the August 10th GMC membership meeting. I'm David Lubar, Chair of the GMC and CEO of Lubar & Company. I understand Zoom has added some additional security features, so I hope it wasn't too difficult to get into today's webinar. I'd like to begin today's meeting by welcoming three new GMC members: Kate Brewer, CEO of Greenfield Rehabilitation; Patrick O'Brien, Chairman of the Board and co-founder of Patina Solutions; and Paul Sweeney, co-founder of PS Capital Partners. Kate, Patrick, and Paul, we welcome you to the GMC and look forward to your involvement and contribution. Today's meeting topic is racial equity. The GMC is committed to advancing racial equity work in Milwaukee through education, communication, and action. Today, we will be hearing from Adam Carr, Deputy Editor for Community Engagement at the Neighborhood News Service, and Rob Smith, Director of Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach at Marquette University. Adam and Rob will be presenting on March on Milwaukee, which is the history behind the fair housing marches of 1967, and will provide us insight into Milwaukee's history of inequities within communities of color and the people and organizations who have worked for change over all the years. Through GMC's initiatives and collaboration with our members and partners, we look forward to doing our part to lead Milwaukee to an anti-racist future. We'll also be hearing from Dr. John Raymond, President and CEO of the Medical College of Wisconsin, to share a COVID-19 update. We are not a political organization, but we sent out a message very recently following the governor's mandate, and we support wearing masks and social distancing as two very cost-effective and medically effective actions to limit the spread of COVID-19. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to report that on Friday, the Wisconsin Policy Forum released a report entitled "Arts and Culture in a Pandemic," citing the major challenges artists and arts and culture and culture organizations in Wisconsin are facing during the pandemic due to canceled shows, programs, fundraisers, and classes. Consequently, unemployment has increased sharply in arts and culture. State estimates show that 33% or even higher of those employed in arts, entertainment, and recreation in Wisconsin filed for initial claims for unemployment between March 15th and July 5th. With Wisconsin allocating fewer dollars per capita to arts and culture than any other state in the country, it highlights the importance of an organization like UPAF, the United Performing Arts Fund, and its importance to supporting arts and artists and their organizations. The UPAF annual campaign is drawing to a close. If you have not donated and you are in support of the arts and cultural organizations, we hope that you will contribute. With that, I'd like to now turn this over to Dr. John Raymond for an update on COVID-19.
Thanks, David, and good day, everyone. I'll start with cumulative tests. We've tested now, if I go to the first slide, thanks, over 1 million people in Wisconsin at 1,054,000, and 204,000 of those tests have been administered here in Milwaukee. We've had 60,000 positive tests since the beginning of the pandemic, with a 5.7% positivity rate. And that's been stable over the last few weeks, but it had been under 5%, and we really want that percentage to be under 5%. That means that we're testing adequate numbers of patients. And in Milwaukee, we've had 20,000, almost 21,000 positive tests with a 10.2 positivity rate. We were trending under 10% for a while, but again, with the increased numbers that we've seen during the surge over the last few weeks, that went back up under 10%. And again, ideally, we want that to be under 5%. Now, early in the pandemic, almost half of the cases were here in Milwaukee. And as you can see, as the pandemic has matured and spread over the state, that we're now down to about 20% of the positive tests, or a third of the positive tests, and 20% of the tests administered. Now, yesterday was a light testing day with about 7,400 tests administered. And we have a testing capacity of about 24,000 in Wisconsin, and that's been stable after a very significant growth phase in May, June, and early July. Now, I'm hearing new concerns about the supply chain for testing reagents, both the deep nasopharyngeal swabs and also the reagents necessary to do the polymerase chain reaction test. And this was actually reported in Wisconsin Health News this morning. And in fact, one southeastern Wisconsin health system had to pull back from community testing sites due to reagent shortages. So this is a concern that needs to be followed. Now, we do have 83 current laboratories that are doing testing, with 24 planning to test in the future. Again, their ability to test is going to be limited by the availability of the testing reagents. Now, in terms of daily positive tests, we have seen a very significant surge both in Milwaukee and in the state of Wisconsin over the last few weeks. And there have been multiple days where we've had more than 1,000 positive tests reported. And Saturday was the highest single day total reported in Wisconsin since the beginning of the pandemic, with about 1,150 positive tests. Now, yesterday we had 621 tests that were positive in Wisconsin and an 8.4% positivity rate, and only 142 in Milwaukee. And our 7-day average positivity rate was 5.8%, so that is improving. So the daily positives are trending slowly downward, even in the state of Wisconsin, despite those multiple days over 1,000. And the positivity rate, unfortunately, if you look at the last 3 weeks, is trending upward slightly in Wisconsin, although over the last 10 days, it seems to have been going down. And it's important to note the number of positive tests and the positivity rate are early indicators of what may be coming down the road in 6 weeks. And I do want to mention 66 of our 72 counties have high activity currently, with the other six with medium activity. And those 6 with medium activity are Bayfield, Florence, Green Lake, Rock, Rusk, and Vernon. Now, there are 9 counties that have high activity that are trending favorably, and those include Milwaukee and Waukesha. However, there are 14 counties with high activity that are trending unfavorably, including Racine, Ozaukee, Washington, and Walworth here. Now, this slide here shows cumulative hospitalizations. We're actually doing pretty well. We have 5,000 cumulative hospitalizations with an 8.3% likelihood that if you have a positive test, you'll be admitted to the hospital. And that hospitalization rate has gone down consistently since the beginning of the pandemic, when we were seeing a 30% likelihood of hospitalization, in part due to the increased availability of testing, the ability to identify people earlier in the course of their disease and provide supportive and preventive care, and that we know now a whole lot more about how to take care of COVID-19 patients. Yesterday, we had 352 inpatients with COVID-19. That's fine in terms of capacity. We have plenty of beds available, but I do want to note that that's up a fairly significant amount, almost 50% since our low on July the 4th. In ICUs, we had 98. Again, that's up from the low of 65 on July the 5th. And it's worth noting that hospitalizations and ICUs are lagging indicators that can lag maybe 2 to 3 weeks behind the increase in the case positivity. ICU capacity, we have lots of available ICU beds. So we have 325 ICU beds available and lots of ventilator capacity, 1,645. Now that's stable, but I do want to mention that we've been tracking about 1,000 ventilators available. And when the reporting switched from the CDC to HHS a couple of weeks ago, they also required for us to include surge capacity ventilators that really can't be used for the long run. These would be repurposed from procedure rooms and recovery rooms. PPE trends are stable with the most critical needs goggles and paper gowns. But I will mention that our health systems have expressed new concerns about the fragility and vulnerability of the PPE supply chains. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about deaths. We have 998 deaths that have been reported in Wisconsin so far, 389 in Milwaukee. And it's important to note that death is probably the most important indicator, and it's highly lagging. And I'll talk about that a little bit later with a different slide. And deaths as a percentage of COVID-19 cases, or the case fatality rate, continues to drop. It's down to 1.6%, which is very good. And this continues to improve. And I think there are three reasons for this. One, we're much more aggressive about protecting those in congregate living situations like nursing homes. Two, we have availability of more testing so that we can test people earlier. And three, we have better supportive care. So the death rates in Wisconsin and Milwaukee appear to be flat over the last several weeks, but it is noteworthy that we had a clear uptick in deaths toward the end of July. And deaths, like the number of newly diagnosed cases and positivity rates, do disproportionately affect people in communities of color, as demonstrated on the table in this slide. I'm not going to go over each of the indicators, but I do want to talk about trends that we've been tracking over the last few weeks. And when you examine total deaths, there has been an increase in the percentage of deaths in white and Hispanic individuals, decrease in the percentage of deaths in Black and African American individuals. And this really isn't surprising because the new cases have been trending significantly toward whites and especially toward Hispanic populations for the last 2 months. Now the doubling time's out to 36 days in Wisconsin and 44.5 days in Milwaukee. Again, significantly improved from the 3-day doubling times we had early in the pandemic. Although this seems promising, but what it means is that without a change in the rate of the growth of the pandemic, we're going to have 60,000 more cases in Wisconsin by mid-September and 20,000 more cases in Milwaukee by late September. So we need to maintain our diligence. The 7-day mean growth rate continues to trend favorably, 1.4% in Wisconsin and 0.9% in Milwaukee. And recall that that was between 30 and 35% early in the pandemic. Reproductive number is at 1.01 in Wisconsin and 0.90 in Milwaukee. This is a very early indicator, and it's really a measure of the contagiousness of COVID-19. And a reproductive number of 1 means that a person who has COVID-19 passes it on to one other individual, which means that the pandemic trajectory is flat, either improving or getting worse. Now, ideally, we want that reproductive number to be below 1.0 to decelerate the pandemic. Now, the good news is for the last 2.5 weeks, Milwaukee's been at or under 1, with the trend favorably, particularly clear in Milwaukee. And on the other hand, we do have a high burden of disease, so continued vigilance is essential. If I could go to the next slide, you've seen this before. This slide compares the 7-day reproductive numbers since early March for Milwaukee in gold and Wisconsin in blue. And starting from the left, you can see that we took a troubling turn in mid-June with reproductive numbers climbing over 1.0 for 40 consecutive days. Now, the Milwaukee mask ordinance went into effect on July 17th, and a few days later, the 7-day average reproductive number dipped under 1, and it stayed there for the last 2.5 weeks. Wisconsin also dipped under 1 and has remained at or slightly less than 1 for the last 2.5 weeks. Now, just for your information, the Dane County mask ordinance went into effect on July 13th and the Wisconsin mask order on July 30th. We can go to the next and final slide. This slide shows in Wisconsin, the lag between new cases shown in gold and the deaths shown in blue. And I'm frequently asked about this lag. So although the trends may not be that easy to track due to relatively low numbers compared to other states, I did want to show you this, and I want to draw your attention to the middle of the graph. The left-hand red dot shows the inflection point of clearly increased daily case counts that happened in mid-June. The right-hand red dot shows the inflection point of increased daily deaths, which occurred about 5 weeks later in mid to late July, as shown on the blue graph. Now, the reasons for the lag include, for the primary cases, the time to hospitalization, ICU, and then death. And for secondary cases, from exposure to symptom development to hospitalization and death. And because the demographic of newly diagnosed cases has shifted recently to younger individuals who are less likely to require hospitalization, the lag might even be further prolonged until the infection's been passed along to older family members, coworkers, customers, and friends. So to summarize, we continue to struggle with COVID-19 in Wisconsin, perhaps doing slightly better in Milwaukee than in other parts of the state. And early indicators seem stable or slightly improved, but deaths have increased from the lows that we saw in early July. So we strongly advise continuing vigilance. And with that, I'll turn it back over to David.
Actually, John, I'm going to take over and drive here, but thank you very much. It's very sobering news, and we really appreciate your updates and your perspective on what's happening in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin. Thank you. The leadership of the GMC has been and remains a crucial catalyst for change in Milwaukee. This moment is a call to action to intentionally address racial and systemic inequities in our city. Fortunately, we're already rooted in this work, and now is the time to accelerate our work and explicitly focus on the issues of racial equity that impact the lives of all who live here. In 2016, our leaders agreed to operate with an equity lens, and now is the time to commit to anti-racism. As a membership, we have the responsibility to understand and educate ourselves on issues, listen to our city's residents, and boldly advocate for impact systemic change. Our board of directors met on July 23rd to discuss how we should respond to racial equity issues in Milwaukee. And this first discussion is just the beginning of a journey. Thank you to many of the members who completed the Racial Equity Pulse Check Survey. It's aided us a great deal in the direction of immediate next steps. We listened to your responses, which included requests for resources, education, and discussion on how we work with the community to create a more equitable Milwaukee. The survey results showed that many members are interested in cohort learning groups and book clubs. Currently, we are gathering information and creating a plan of action for the cohort training. Over 50 members want to participate, and we will be able to accommodate all who are interested. Our goal is to begin the cohort trainings in the fall. We already have a group of 7 GMC members who are participating in the YWCA 6-week Unlearning Racism course, as well as myself and David Lubar. And we will be offering book groups to educate members and facilitate discussion. Last week, we asked the interested members to vote on the book of their choice. We've got those results, and so we'll begin the book clubs at the end of August, starting with the book White Fragility, The Color of Law, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Just Mercy. Milwaukee is also home to 53206, a zip code well documented for having the highest rate of incarcerated African Americans in the country. The highly rated Milwaukee 53206 documentary highlights this extreme reality. GMC and the Marcus Corporation are pairing up to show a drive-in viewing of this movie shortly. And after the film, we've organized a panel discussion surrounding the systemic issues that African Americans and other racial and ethnic groups in our communities face. We want to ensure that our programs and our policies always align with the needs of communities of color and work together to overcome the history of systemic racism. All of the current challenges we are facing didn't begin overnight, nor did the fight for equity. For the remainder of today's program, we will hear from Adam Carr and Rob Smith as they share the history of the marches in Milwaukee on 1967, the Fair Housing Marches. Unfortunately, we are still dealing with a safe and affordable housing crisis, a crisis that GMC and our partners are working to overcome through Milwaukee United and the Anti-Displacement Fund. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam Carr. He works at the intersection of community and communication. His work ranges from writing to media, public art to in-depth tours. He was co-chair for the coordinating committee of the March on Milwaukee 50th, which commemorated Milwaukee's open housing marches with 200 Nights of Freedom in 2017 to 2018. 2016, he authored the children's book, Explore Milwaukee, Your Neighborhood is Our City. And Dr. Robert Smith, who's joining Adam, is the Harry G. John Professor of History and Director of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach at Marquette University. His research and teaching interests include African American history, civil rights history, and exploring the intersections of race and law. Dr. Smith is the author of Race, Labor, and Civil Rights, Griggs versus Duke Power, and the Struggle for Equal Employment Opportunity. During the presentation, please use the Q&A box to submit comments to Adam and Rob. They'll incorporate questions into their presentation rather than having a formal Q&A at the end. Please welcome Adam and Rob today.
Afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for your time. I absolutely appreciated the update on COVID as well. So thank you, Dr. Raymond. I've certainly appreciated the various ways you all and the staff over at MCW have kept us up to date on developments. It's been very, very useful and reassuring to know that we have that expertise at our hand. What's going on, Adam?
Hey, Rob. You know what? I'm going to start sharing my screen here.
Yeah, that wraps up the formal presentation for today. The rest of this is we welcome everybody into the conversation. We want you to be a part of the conversation. When we started doing this a long time ago, working with young people, we wanted to make sure they understood the history is actually, while challenging and complicated, it's also fun and engaging. So we welcome as much as engagement along the way as possible. Go ahead, man.
And with that, I mean, I would just give a real simple introduction that I grew up in the city. I consider myself to have had the most remarkable set of privileges of growing up here, going to great Milwaukee public schools, growing up in great neighborhoods with good families and friends. But this is a story that I never learned. It's one since I started having the chance to engage with it for the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches. It's when I realized it's been one of the great tragedies of our city that we haven't shared it. So with that, I wish we didn't have to do this. I wish everyone just knew the story of open housing just as a course of being part of the city.
Let me also say, Adam, in terms of the national narrative about civil rights activism and civil rights movements, that we'll get into some of the framing in here in just a second, but for a local movement to sustain itself over 200 days is indeed remarkable. And that's not including the activity that sought to desegregate schools with Lloyd Barbie. That doesn't include some of the earlier efforts around the work the NAACP and the youth councils were doing prior to the open housing marches. That doesn't include the efforts associated with urban renewal and urban renewal programs in the city that were very important. So we have, in many respects, as central of a civil rights historical narrative as any other local movement and local community. And we want to make sure to center that.
And with that, we are going to let the introduction to the story of the open housing marches come from Ms. Pamela Jo Sargent. She's going to jump right into the thick of the action, and then we'll do some backtracking to build context. And here we go. Here's Pamela Jo.
When we first marched across the 16th Street Viaduct, I had never been so afraid in my life. I was a kid, and my mother was deceased, but I had my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, so I was loved, even though I didn't have my parents, but I was a loved child. And I was raised with love. And when I marched across that viaduct, they had estimated it was like 10,000 people. They were hanging out the windows. They were all on the side of us. And they were hollering, "Niggas, go home, go back to Africa." They were throwing things at us. When we passed Crazy Jim's auto, he was allowing these people to pull the light bulbs off of where he kept the cars and throw them at us. I had never experienced hatred like that. And I'm like, what could I have possibly done for someone to look at me? And if you notice, I'm 14 and a half, 66 years old, and I weigh a $105. So if I was 11, I probably weighed 50. But I'm out there and I got this vigor and I got this fire in my heart and in my soul to say, you can move on the South Side if you got the money. You can bring your family over here. If they want to come to the North Side, they can come over here. Why can't I come and live over here? And these people were telling me, not only could I not come over here and live, nigga girl, you go back to Africa. I didn't know nothing about Africa. I was born in Chicago and raised in Milwaukee. It was terrible. My dear brother in Christ, Tommy Lee Woods, one of the commandos, he's deceased right now, and he was one of the protectors of the march. He said, Pam, duck. And I looked and I didn't duck. And a brick hit me in my head. And I wear this scar. It's a badge of honor. I have it from here all the way to the middle of my head, where I was hit with a brick on that march. But I kept going. We covered it up, we held it, and we kept going, and we got to Kosciuszko Park.
That is Pamela Jo Sargent. Just a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. Rob and I have had many, many, many collaborators over the last few years in building the story and telling it. Most recently, we've been working with Heather Godley, who's an educator, Kristen Leffelman from Wisconsin Historical Society, and Keisha, who works with Rob at Curdo and is also at Marquette University. That said, actually starting in 2016, we did a lot of work for the 50th anniversary of Milwaukee's open housing marches. What we ended up doing, we could talk about that for a long time, but very briefly, we did in the same ways that the marches went on for 200 consecutive nights, we did 200 consecutive nights of programming that was in the hands of the many different organizations around Milwaukee. These are just some of them. There were over 200 organizations and institutions, and by far more than that, individuals who touched the project overall. And that was done really purely from the desire of people to reconnect with this story of the open housing marches. A lot of people learning it for the first time, being inspired by it, and then using it as an example to live in Milwaukee in the present day. So,
Adam, let me, folks listening, let me make sure to acknowledge the importance of historians and archivists along the way, particularly those folks over at UWM, in the creation of the March on Milwaukee digital database. It is an award-winning collection that has done a great job of really gathering a wide array of materials that documents this local movement. It is indeed a trove, and so you could type in March on Milwaukee archive and you could get right to that. I just wanted to make sure to say, give a quick shout out for that collection, because it does document that moment in our city's history in remarkable fashion.
So with that, I mean, Rob is going to kick things off a little bit, and this is, you know what? We don't have the chat open. We have Q&A. So, yeah. Rob, do you just want to jump right into the framing, some ideas that can help us get involved here?
Yeah, part of what we do is we really structure these so that they are functional for the classroom. We've been spending quite a bit of time this summer developing and packaging digital modules that teachers can very easily use in the classroom. And so part of what I like to do is offer some framing so that we can situate where we understand Milwaukee's civil rights movement in that broader history, that broader narrative of civil rights and struggles for racial equality. But then also I'd like to talk a little bit about the ways in which to think around and about teaching some of this stuff in the classroom in very practical ways. The first thing that we like to start with is that we really want to frame this in a longer struggle for Black freedom and liberation. That the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a significant upsurge and significant watershed moment, but it's been part of a longer struggle. And so we use these 4 points to get at some of that framing. First of which is the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a movement to change the law. In short fashion, what was all the protesting, the boycotting, the marching, what was all that about? It was about wanting to end the system of legal segregation, most infamously referred to as Jim Crow. And folks, if you please jump in with Q&A. I wish we had the chat available for you so you could just use it. But for the Q&A version, just drop whatever thoughts or comments or ideas you have in. We typically invite people into this process much earlier, but given our time situation, we want to be a bit more efficient. But the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a movement designed and intended to change the law. It's also been a very long movement for Black equality, and that gets us into questions about when to start. It's been a movement of local movements. Maybe most importantly, this movement was not a neatly engineered national conversation. Local movements were critical in shaping what becomes a national agenda. And then most importantly, I think, is that youth have played a central role in social change more broadly, and this movement is an indication of the ways in which young people are central to impacting not only the current moment, but the future in ways that are in line with their vision of democracy. So let's move to the next slides, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because the heart of what we do is really image driven, because we talk largely and most often to young people. We want to make sure that they are welcomed into the historical debate by encouraging them to be historians and encouraging them to be archivists. You know, we often will say if you stumbled into an archive and you came upon these images, what would you say? What would you think? How would you interpret them? So you'll see quite a bit of images here in our presentation. First and foremost, a movement to change the law. These images are very clearly from the Jim Crow era. You see sharecroppers on the right. You see the infamous Scottsboro boys there on the far left. And in the middle, you see a classroom that includes Linda Brown from the landmark decision, Brown versus Board of Education. The goal was to change the law of Jim Crow to end legal segregation, but also to uproot the myriad efforts that had disfranchised African Americans. Jim Crow was not only a question of legal segregation, it was also maintained through the practice of denying African Americans access to the ballot box. Similarly, we see and the image from the sharecroppers indicates this, that indeed in some cases very little had changed in the United States, particularly in the South and rural areas since slavery. In fact, for the Brown decision, which was a conglomeration of 5 cases, and one case out of South Carolina, one legal scholar once wrote that if you'd gone anywhere in the United States since the ending of slavery in the 1950s, Clarendon County, South Carolina would have been the place that had changed the least. And so this long-standing efforts to maintain a system that subjugated African Americans economically were also part and parcel to Jim Crow. And then of course, the most heinous component to Jim Crow, or the acts of racial violence most notoriously highlighted in lynchings. And so the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, where we have so much of a rich historical consciousness and a historical memory around it, was indeed a movement to change the law. Let's go to the next slide, Adam. You know, what we often do is think about this fundamental question of, well, when do you start it? If the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was but one moment, when do we start this question around the movement for Black equality and racial equality? And I once had a mentor of mine say, well, we could go back as far as when the first African resisted slavery. For my purposes, I like to go back to 1865, the moment of the abolition of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, reads the 13th Amendment. I like to spend a lot of time with the 14th Amendment. I often encourage folks to think about the 14th Amendment. Most folks will say, well, I don't really know it. But then once you start using words like equal protection, due process, birthright, citizenship, naturalization, we come very clearly and squarely into an awareness that we do know the 14th Amendment. It's our contract with the government. It's our contract as citizens. It earmarks indeed the breadth of citizenship in so many respects and in so many ways. But the question of when to begin this movement for Black equality could go back to slavery. We could go in 1865 with abolition and Reconstruction. That's where I like to start because of the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments. We could move into the late 19th century where we start to see the emergence of Black women's clubs and other ways in which African Americans are mobilizing and organizing, largely in opposition to Jim Crow. We see massive out-migration from the South beginning in the 19th century and then picking up again in the 20th century. We also could make the argument that the roots of the 1950s and 60s certainly have their beginning somewhere around the 1920s and 30s with the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro movement, because that's one generation before that massive upsurge, and it informs quite a bit about what happens then in the 1950s and 60s, whether it's the way that the artists and the politicians are collectively addressing these questions around racial inequality, or the boisterous nature of the Garvey movement, the way it shapes notions of radicalism for the next several decades. So when we begin the movement is useful for discussion and debate. Let's keep going, Adam. And as we think about Milwaukee, as we think about the histories that we are most familiar with, and typically what we would like to do is have folks drop ideas. And if we were to ask the question, name locations where civil rights activism occurred, and feel free to play along if you like. Where did the civil rights movement occur?
You know what, Rob? We just opened up the chat, so we can
Ooh,
actually.
We got the chat open. Okay. All right. Nice. Thank you very much.
So the question so you guys can enter right in the chat. What are some places, some locations that you associate with the civil rights movement?
Alabama, absolutely. Montgomery, Selma. Mobile had a rich civil rights history as well in Alabama. The Montgomery bus boycott, we can't start this conversation and not bring that into focus. Obviously, Greensboro, North Carolina, home of the sit-ins.
Got Memphis.
Absolutely, we have to talk about Atlanta, not only because of the significance of it being a southern city, an important city in the South, Little Rock, and the struggles around school desegregation. Atlanta is significant because of the presence of historically Black colleges and universities, much like Nashville. And so if we were to think about if we would try to think about geography, one of the key components to Cicero, Illinois, absolutely, where Dr. King obviously said was his most frightened experience, not in the South, but in the North, a movement of local movements, that this patchwork of local movements that were somewhat sculpted and somewhat connected, but really the local realities, the local expertise allowed for each of these local movements to have their own distinctive flair. So this was a movement of local movements. This was a collection of movements that expanded not only across the South, but across the country. And then of course that long movement becomes both wide and then increases in its depth as we dig into the local experiences. And so these are important thoughts as we consider how we connect struggles. Newark, absolutely. And these urban experiences, thank you, Liana, these urban experiences we often leave out of the conversation. But indeed, as you probably know, and as you'll see with the color of law, the many challenges associated with residential discrimination are indeed national in their scope. And then last and certainly not least is the significance of young people in this process. We cannot witness any significant social change, and we have not witnessed significant social change in this country if young people are not in the mix, if young people are not directly connected. And we see here the SNCC workers who were murdered during Freedom Summer in 1964. We see also SNCC activist Diane Nash, and rest in peace, C.T. Vivian to her right, just recently passed, the young men at the Woolworth counter in Greensboro. And we also want to make sure to keep in mind how young people push us culturally, whether it's through hip hop music, whether it's through punk music or other ways in which young people challenge us in very clear and direct ways in terms of some of our cultural practices and some of our cultural institutions. And even more recently, we saw a remarkable expression of youth activism as young people organized and emerged in Washington, D.C., demanding reform in our nation's gun laws. And so young people, as we will see in this story, are vital to social change. And we see it all today, right? We see it happening across the country over and over every day. These are very young folks who are demanding that our democracy stand for what it says it should. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, indeed, indeed. Adam, you want to get going with us in Milwaukee? Let's go into Milwaukee now. We've got the frame. We know where we're headed in terms of these key thoughts around the national context. So let's dig in a little bit here locally.
Absolutely. The movement, I mean, to wrap all of four Rob's framing points in, the movement in Milwaukee was a long one, led by young people to change the law of open housing. So Pamela Jo Sargent mentioned at the very beginning that she was confronted by a racist mob that had assembled at Crazy Jim's auto lot, and that is exactly what we're looking at right now. Actually, in the chat, can anybody tell me where this intersection is? What intersection this is, where this remarkable dramatic image took place within the city of Milwaukee? Anyone have any idea? I bet some of you are competitive out there. To get you guys feeling competitive, we have young people all over the city who can tell us where this intersection is. So can you guys match?
We should highlight, we do these talks with the young folks over at the Bell Phillips Center, and they really taught us how to do this in a much more dynamic way. Those young folks are really, their minds are sharp. They understand our city in ways that is really impressive.
So John's saying 16th and Clybourne, just flip yourself over the viaduct and you'll be correct. So someone tell me, it is in fact very near the 16th Street Bridge. I'll give you a hint. Where those young men are standing on top of cars holding racist signs, many of them who unscrewed light bulbs and threw them at the marchers, that is today the location of a Popeyes restaurant. That is, yep, that's it. National Avenue and Cesar Chavez Drive. So this is an image, we have a lot of images. This is going to be very driven by photos of this. These images are all from our city. Sometimes when I grew up seeing images of the civil rights movement or footage of the civil rights movement, it always felt really far away. Yet those shoes on that sidewalk in this photograph are on the sidewalks of our city. It was, in fact, a remarkably dramatic set of events that happened during the open housing marches, and it actually spilled into the subsequent years and in a different geography, other protests on the south side of Milwaukee led by Latino folks. And indeed, the whole point of the open housing marches was open housing. You can see here, this is the sign, and we wanted to use this to go into it, that those folks have rallied around to create change. So this is at the old St. Boniface, which is today where North Division High School is, kind of in the back. And with that, we have a little bit of context to set. So when the story of the open housing marches began in 1967, Milwaukee had seen a remarkable upsurge, as Rob mentioned very briefly, during the Great Migration of Black families moving from the South up to the North, up to the East Coast, to the West Coast. Milwaukee saw a huge influx of African Americans moving here during and after World War II and the second wave of the Great Migration. About a generation or two after the first wave, which was spurred on by World War I, Milwaukee's Black population moved from somewhere in the realm less than 10,000 to about 100,000 in a span of about 30 years. So Milwaukee saw a huge influx of African-American folks who came here predominantly to find work and opportunity. This photo is of Walnut Street. Walnut Street was the center of Black business in the entire state of Wisconsin. at a time when Milwaukee had one of the wealthiest, one of the most thriving middle-class Black communities in the entire country. So I just want to repeat that because we don't often hear that. In the 50s and 60s, Milwaukee had one of the wealthiest Black communities in the entire country, and in fact had the highest Black-owned business per capita. So the Milwaukee's Black community, its business community was centered here right on Walnut Street. Every single one of these buildings was torn down for the sake of urban renewal. Some of them were torn down for the highway, but a lot of them were torn down otherwise to build housing, and some kind of for, it seems in retrospect, no good reason at all. Walnut Street, this backbone of Black business in the city of Milwaukee, all of these structures have been destroyed. So in a lot of ways, what we're looking at are ghosts. So one of the reasons Milwaukee's Black community had so many businesses was the wealth that was contained within the community, but this is another reason. In the chat, I'm sure all of you, at least you should by now, know what kind of, because of Richard Rothstein's work and many others, should know what this map represents. Can anybody tell me what this is? What is the word you associate with a map that looks like this? Absolutely, Tony. So redlining, this is a redlining map of the city of Milwaukee. Long story short, this one I think was authored in about 1930. The neighborhoods and communities in Milwaukee and around the country, and it wasn't just Milwaukee, were graded A, B, C, or D. Neighborhoods that were graded D were deemed hazardous for investment and were basically anyone offering a financial product, whether that was insurance, whether that was a loan, whether that was even a bank account, they were told, don't do business in those neighborhoods. I want to point out here, this wasn't a guy saying, in my opinion, this neighborhood is hazardous. These are federal documents, and this is federal guidance for those financial institutions. So when we say systemic or institutional racism, this is exactly what we mean. This isn't a guy in a Facebook comment who's saying, I feel a racist thought. These are people who are in power shaping the systems that we still live inside of largely today. There were redlining lawsuits settled in Milwaukee within the last 5 years, within the last 10 years, last 20 years. Redlining for sure has been a durable institution despite the fact that it was deemed illegal at the end of the story. This is what is known as a restrictive real estate covenant. So what we want to establish, we want to establish why open housing was such a big deal. Black folks in Milwaukee were being systematically denied the ability to get loans and to create generational wealth within their families by buying homes, which we understand is kind of the pathway to the middle class. Also, another vehicle of the path to the middle class, the building of the suburbs, Black folks, and actually oftentimes only white folks were included in that. This is from Wauwatosa, that Washington Highlands subdivision from 1919. I'll let you guys read that. The language, again, is entirely legal. This isn't just someone with no power or with just an opinion saying, this is how I feel, I don't want Black folks living around me. This is a developer, a real estate developer, as land was being plated and made habitable for people, or as they were creating the sewage system and they were creating the waterworks and the highways and the city streets. This accompanied the building of the suburbs. So in fact, we need to understand that racism and exclusion isn't a glitch of the suburbs. It was actually a feature. Almost all of the suburbs of Milwaukee were built not entirely with, but included subdivisions that had restrictive real estate covenants.
Let me
go ahead,
Adam, because I think it's important to offer just even a little bit more framing. The reason I study the intersections of race and law is because over centuries, and even here if we look at over decades, if there's a set of policies that reinforce this kind of basic class growth and progression and class elitism, that ultimately will begin to shape attitudes about who's undeserving. And so if you're a part of a legal system that includes you in that deserving element, then ultimately someone has to be undeserving. Some population who's being excluded has to be excluded for some reason, and that helps to fuel a whole range of the attitudes we have about race and class. The other thing I want to share is while we're talking about the racial geographies of the city of Milwaukee, there's one important development that is specific to northern states, northern being somewhat loosely defined. And that development is sundown towns. Sundown towns are distinctly northern in that they appear about the time that the migration, the great migration of Black Southerners is picking up and gaining momentum. And we see them pop up throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and other Midwestern states. These are municipalities that have expressly stated or in practice language and attitudes that suggest Black people need to be out of town by sundown, along with the quite impressive list of readings that you have already outlined as part of your anti-racist trajectory. Sundown Towns by James Lowen might be one to read alongside The Color of Welfare, because it shows that not only do our cities remarkably racially segregated and the roots of that, but it also highlights how entire regions and entire states build hostility into the municipal structures. And so I just wanted to make sure to add that, because sundown towns would be a great complement to The Color of Law. Go ahead, man.
To crib a term from Rob that he said before is, I mean, you say all the time, is that, you know, Jim Crow South, sometimes we absolve ourselves as being a Midwestern or Northern state by saying, you know, we had nothing to do with slavery, we had nothing to do with Jim Crow. But what Rob just pointed out, that as soon as there was a critical mass of Black folks living in the North, folks, the systems of cities like Milwaukee, states like Wisconsin, scrambled to enforce Jim Crow North. So I think when we talk about the Jim Crow South, we have to understand that as Black folks left the racial system, the racialized system of terrorism known as Jim Crow South, the North also tried to instate through these kinds of loopholes and laws, like restrictive covenants, like sundown towns, like redlining, that exact kind of system that would have the same effect as Jim Crow South. So now we are to the protagonists of our story, the Youth Council. Youth Council of Milwaukee, they were formed really through the 40s and 50s as an honor society. The local chapter of the NAACP saw their youth council as being kind of really a way for young people to train to be successful professional adults. The youth council, though, started seeing on television the civil rights movement down south, and they started looking at their city and saying, wow, we have problems just like they do down south up here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Why don't we use some of the same tactics they're using down in the south to agitate here up north around some of the same issues that are giving us challenges? So the Youth Council, in 1962, they got their first advisor. His name was John Givens. He was a Black man from Milwaukee who had served in the military. When he had been stationed in France, they treated him so well that the village he was staying in petitioned for him to be able to stay there forever, but the army declined it and sent him back to Milwaukee, where he was treated like dirt. So imagine this, a man who served in the military for the sake of his own country, then being sent back to Milwaukee, where then he was treated in a subhuman way. And that got him really frustrated. He got involved in the civil rights movement, was very interested in nonviolent direct action, and helped lead the Youth Council into their first acts of nonviolent direct action and protest. They picketed a Big Boys in town that was owned by Ben Marcus, and the Youth Council had sent in, they had received a complaint from a teenager who sought a job at that Big Boy. He was declined. Then they sent in a white teenager with the exact same set of qualifications. That white teenager was hired. So these are sophisticated tactics that they're using. Eventually, Ben Marcus had a meeting with the Youth Council at the Pfister Hotel, and they brokered a deal. And that same teenager, the Black teenager who was denied employment, was later hired. So there are examples of the Youth Council being really successful in this early phase. And at that time, the NAACP started to get a little nervous about their young people. Much like we're seeing today in the protests, you have adults saying, whoa, you guys are out in the street. You know, the NAACP has been working really hard to get a seat at the table. We might get it taken away. And the young people said, we're not going to wait for humanity to be observed, for our lives to matter. We're going to get out in the street and agitate. Eventually, the NAACP said, okay, we're going to calm you down. And the way we're going to do it is by our first introduction to the NAACP Youth Council. Second one is a Catholic priest named James Groppe. Father James Groppe wore Buddy Holly glasses, looked kind of nerdy. The NAACP thought if he's going to be their advisor, it might calm them down, having a man of the cloth. Turns out Father James Groppe had been involved in civil rights activities down south. He'd been involved in seen the success of some of those things. And what he said, I'm going to say this very, very specifically in a way that oftentimes it isn't told this way. Father James Groppe saw the work of the Youth Council and said, I'm a big fan of your work. I would love to support you to take it to the next level. So the reason I'm saying it that way is oftentimes Father Groppe is the single name that's associated with civil rights in the city of Milwaukee. That is a remarkable error that I think James Groppe would vehemently disagree with. I think what was genius about his leadership was the way in which he invited young people into their own power and supported them as they wrote the story of the open housing marches alongside him, Bill Phillips, the Commandos, and others. So now that we're looking at this image, I'm going to ask that same questions, kind of some basic ones. I want everyone who's looking at this image, tell me where this is. Let's do a where first. Where are we? And I know someone in here, I mean, some of you, yeah, where is this? This is the rave. So John hit it right on the nose. This is the Eagles Club on Wisconsin Avenue, indeed. Now, that's a where. Can anyone tell me why? What might be the reason? If you were just to put it together, I promise you, your first guest is probably right. Why might the Youth Council be mounting a protest against the rave or the Eagles Club at this time? Absolutely. So, and I actually do want to point, so Leanna, okay, I'm going to synthesize what John said and get to Leanna's comment there. Not only did they not allow blacks as members, the Eagles Club had a whites only policy. So if you're anything but white, you were not allowed inside. And Leanna jumped to a really important point. It's actually the great irony of this image. The Youth Council could not buy a ticket to go see Duke Ellington. You know who else could not buy a ticket to go see Duke Ellington?
Duke Ellington.
Duke Ellington.
The 30 members of his band.
Absolutely. So Duke Ellington and his big band could not buy a ticket to see their own show. When the Youth Council saw these contradictions, these affronts to their humanity, they said this cannot stand. So they went, and you know who else? Marquette University booked dances at the Eagles Club. The Eagles Club, you know, it wasn't just some private club. It was part of the center of civic life in Milwaukee. So the Youth Council saw those contradictions and said that cannot stand. They got out into the street and they started to protest. So,
Adam, let's go back. One more question. How old are the folks, particularly the young man up front here? Let's get some guesses about age as best as you can. This young man up front nearest Father Groppe, there's another young person whose face we can make out there. As best as you can, let's get some age guesses.
16? What else we got?
Anybody else?
We're guessing here.
Anybody say 14? Can I get a 14?
Got a 15?
15? Yeah. 14. I got a 14. Okay.
All right. So as we move forward, I mean, the Youth Council, these young folks agitating for change. Now, how old are these kids? So give me some more guesses. This is them at St. Boniface after they were denied by the Catholic Church the ability to have a freedom school. How old do you think some of these kids are? 12? How about this guy on the stairs? He's dressed like he's 50, but he's probably, that guy, he could be like 6. Yeah. This is a little kid. I want to point out here, this is them. One thing they're singing. They often dance. That was a major form of their protest. They really had the Youth Council of Milwaukee. They were exuberant. They were joyful when they protested. It looked and it sounded young. I want to point out a photo bomber here. Not too early for photo bombing. Also, I want to point out this guy has no idea what's going on. So, point of these images is the Youth Council were taking, it was a group of young people, 18 and under, a lot of high school, middle school, grade school students who basically said, we cannot wait for our rights to kick in. We have to go out and take them. All right, this is our third introduction. This is an incredible woman named Vel R. Phillips, the Honorable Vel Phillips, the late Vel Phillips. This is, Vel was a first of many things. She was a trailblazer throughout her entire life and career. She was the first Black woman to graduate from UW-Madison's law school. She was the first Black and first female alderperson. She was also, she had a trailblazing career as a Black female judge in the state of Wisconsin. Until Mandela Barnes was elected in 2018, she was the only African-American elected to statewide office as Secretary of State in the history of Wisconsin. So there's only been 2 African-American folks ever elected to statewide office in Wisconsin. Vel was one of them. Vel did have good friends and family and a network of folks that supported her professionally, but oftentimes when she was on the job, it looked more like this. This is Vel in City Hall, in the Common Council chambers. I would invite you all now to interpret this photo with us. How does Vel look? What is her emotional state? What is Vel thinking right now? What's going on? Someone offer an interpretation of her. What's Vel thinking? Upset?
Good.
Worried? Absolutely tired? Questioning? Forlorn? Absolutely.
Yeah, forlorn.
Concerned?
Yeah.
Now, great interpretations. How do her colleagues look? So look at this fella right here, this guy, these guys, and back this guy. Inattentive. You see this little finger right here pointing. Relaxed. Someone said harumph. That's good onomatopoeia. Impatient, disgusted. So we can see what Vel looked like at work. Rob, what do you think these guys in the back are talking about?
Oh man, they cannot wait to go see Duke Ellington tonight. He's a credit to his race.
He's a credit to his race. Absolutely. So Vel Phillips, to that point you just made there, Andrea, am I the only one in the room who thinks this way? She was absolutely. This is an image we use to illustrate. Vel brought before her colleagues 3 times a bill for open housing in the city of Milwaukee, essentially to make restrictive real estate covenants illegal so that you couldn't legally discriminate on the base of race for housing. Each time she was defeated unanimously, despite the fact some of her colleagues had Black constituents who absolutely supported the proposal that she brought in front of them. So Vel, this is the next image is sort of interpretive too. This is Vel at work, but this is Vel outside of City Hall. There were people who supported Vel. There were people who loved the idea of open housing, but they weren't in this chamber. They were behind these barricades. So Vel Phillips was isolated in City Hall, but not in the community. So what she did might seem, I mean, this group of people might actually understand how daring this might feel. It's obvious from the way we're telling the story, but not in retrospect. She formed a collaboration with the youth council. She went to St. Boniface and said, you guys have been out in the streets agitating for change. I've been in City Hall trying to get change. Why don't we join forces? This would be like the most establishment politicians and in the Common Council forming alliances, really direct ones, and marching with on behalf of proposals with the most hardcore grassroots activists out in the street. That doesn't happen. That hasn't happened much since Vel did it in 1967. So Vel, before we get there, one more introduction. This is the 4th group. In 1966, after the Youth Council had created a lot of headlines, a lot of change in the city, a local chapter of the KKK, I'll say that again, a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, they didn't fly here from somewhere else, but the KKK that was embedded locally was real tired of seeing the Youth Council attacking racism. So the KKK decided to stand up for racism, and they firebombed the headquarters of the NAACP. Clear, loud message to the Youth Council when the Youth Council said to the MPD, what are you going to do about this? These are terrorists attacking us. The MPD said, if you don't want trouble, stop making trouble for yourself. So the Youth Council took matters into their own hands and commissioned a group named the Commandos. The Commandos, whereas the Youth Council, 18 and under, the Commandos were 18 and up. Many of them, like the first advisor to the youth council, had served in the military and had military training. Many of them had jobs at factories, many of whom lost their jobs at factories as soon as they joined the commandos. And many of them had been involved in street life. Some of the commandos were real tough guys who were in gangs, and they literally squashed beefs to join the commandos. I cannot tell you how many times in the history of Milwaukee people have squashed beef to join the same team together, because it's happened so few times. So the commandos put their skill sets that they developed to use within the civil rights movement. So, all right, we have the youth council. We have the youth council. We have Father Grappi, we have Bill Phillips, and we have the commandos. And what they said they're going to do on August 26, 1967 is march to the South Side. The South Side at the time was 100% white. Today, it's a predominantly Latino part of town. It was 100% white at the time. And I've been told in telling the story, the defenders of the South Side weren't just Southsiders. There were people who traveled from all over the region who said, if this white neighborhood can't stay white, that's a threat to my white neighborhood. So the South Side and the counter protesters you're about to see in this footage aren't just folks with addresses on the South Side of Milwaukee. They came from all over to defend the sanctity of white community. So what we're gonna see now is a little bit of Vel, a little bit of Grappi, and a little bit of the youth council. Oops, that did not work. There we go.
A person's ownership of property is tied to many conditions. It is subject to deed restrictions, zoning laws, building and housing codes. I can say only one thing. Since I have every feeling this afternoon that this ordinance will be eventually defeated, you will have to face the issue of fair housing squarely and unequivocally.
We march, we're gonna march if they come out or if they stay in the house. We don't care. We're gonna march. That's what's wrong. Everybody's been waiting. We're not gonna wait.
Well, Father, has your marches to the South Side accomplished anything so far for fair housing?
We're going to get fair housing not only for the city of Milwaukee, but we're going to get it on a national scene. And it's going to be this consistent type of courageous protest that's going to bring about fair housing legislation. Frederick Douglass talked about this 100 years ago. He said, no one ever got their rights given to them on a platter. You've got to fight for it, you've got to struggle for it, and that's what we're doing. We're protesting.
There are no longer excuses for inaction or delay. Those people who come every day to St. Boniface Church, and they come from all over the country, come there with the idea that nobody is free until everybody is free, and we intend to march, all of us, until we get just some of the basic freedoms that are ours. If ever a matter demanded the urgent attention and forthright action of this Common Council, this is it. Gentlemen, the time is now. Thank you.
August 28, 1967, a group of about 250 young people marched, starting at North Division, across the 16th Street Bridge, and this is what they encountered. That was a Confederate flag. They were met by somewhere in the realm of 5,000 to 8,000 angry white counter-protesters. That's the police deploying tear gas contained the counter-protesters. They marched all the way to Kosciuszko Park. You just saw the symbol of Kosciuszko Park. That's Chief Breyer. And the Youth Council they encountered, when they got to the South Side, a tidal wave of hatred. This is what they saw. People angry, throwing rocks and bricks, spitting. I just want to point this out. That guy is wearing a professionally printed white power t-shirt. These are images that you see from the first or second day of the marches. So this guy had that t-shirt, in his, what is going on? He had that t-shirt in his closet. Oh, moving ahead, here we go. After the youth council made it to Kosciuszko Park that day, they were kicked out of Kosciuszko Park by a park commissioner because they were saying a prayer and they had reserved a picnic spot, not for a prayer, but a picnic. They made it back to the Freedom House that night and went marching for a second day. The second day of marching, the youth council's numbers grew to about 500. They were met by as many as 12,000 angry white counter-protesters. Again, these were people from around the region, white folks who said, the south side of Milwaukee shall remain white. That is a Confederate flag. That is Crazy Jim's auto lot, holding signs. One of the stories that people tell is they unscrewed those light bulbs and threw them at the marchers as they passed. Again, these are children who are marching. Work don't march. That's a sign that probably someone has held in the last 70 days. That is a car that has white power printed on the side. When the youth council made it home after being chased out of the south side by 12,000 angry white folks, this is what they saw. The Freedom House, which was their headquarters, the Milwaukee Police Department claimed that there was a sniper on the roof, deployed a tear gas canister into the building, set it on fire, and burned it down. The first fire lit by the KKK, the second by the MPD. On the third day, the mayor outlawed marching. The youth council held a rally. In any moment that anyone set foot on the sidewalk, they were tackled, arrested like this for marching solely by virtue of having their soles of their feet on the sidewalk. So,
Adam,
the youth council,
jump in real quick. It's really tempting, and it's been somewhat of the era of the historical narrative to locate these kinds of images and actions only in the South. And we just have to emphasize over and over how the cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, as well, witnessed these same kinds of resistant attitudes and behaviors to calls for equality. And residential space housing is one of the sort of core places, core arenas where we see the sort of viciousness of the response. And you could go across the nation, Detroit, you just see one city after another having these kinds of very aggressive responses to calls for housing justice.
So this is the youth council right here. That's what they look like. About 2 weeks into the marches, they marched every day. The comedian, see, actually right here, you might recognize this Community Custard Center. Today, that's Tasty Twist right on Titonia. So to Rob's point, these are the streets of our city. So the marches started to swell after 2 weeks. As the protests started to gain momentum, Vell's bill was still being stalled. This actually is very recognizable as Lincoln Avenue. These are streets of the South Side. The next street you're going to see them on, this is Mitchell Street. That's St. Anthony's Church. You may recognize that. Again, these marches took place throughout the city, very similar to the marches that we're seeing today. So let's move forward into some of the historical images. The Youth Council said, we're going to march forever. So they marched every day in September of 1967. Every day in October, every day in November, every day in December. This is what it looks like. This is the Youth Council, and this, some of these dramatic scenes. I want to point out here, you see this police officer brandishing a rifle, wearing a tear gas, or wearing a gas mask there. Looks very reminiscent to this guy in this picture after the MPD set a fire at the Freedom House. This man's job was to protect the Youth Council from many people who could be his friends and family. And this is him at the site of the fire. So this is one of the strategic meetings. This is strategic planning. This is maybe not what strategic planning looks like in many of our boardrooms, but this was the commandos and Father Grappi making a plan for that day's march. I want to point out how many members of this table these seats are occupied by Black men, how many are occupied by white men. Father Grappi is really, really, really held up on a pedestal as being kind of the civil rights story of Milwaukee. The commandos, as Father Grappi actually got pulled away as the marches went deeper and deeper into matters around the country, the commandos stepped into a position of leadership, leading on a tactical level, on a daily level, what was happening in the streets of Milwaukee during the marches. The Commandos were a remarkable, and are, Amy made that point earlier, I think it was Amy, that these are people who are still among us. Actually, in the past few years, in the past 3 or 4 years since Rob and I have started working on this, we've seen a fair number of these gentlemen pass away. They're now at that age. This is an image, this is one of Rob's favorite images here of, this is the Youth Council and the Commandos meeting the Milwaukee Police Department.
Yeah, I really do appreciate this image. One, because of the way that space is sort of the heart of the tension. And you can kind of see it, funnel out or funnel back to the background and up to the foreground. But it's also, I think, important for us to see that there's an armed force essentially about to attack young men who are clearly in their stance, preparing, but also they're practitioners of nonviolent civil disobedience. They are attempting to restrain themselves, and yet they are about to be met with extreme force. And also they are dressed in a particular way. There's a certain, I don't know what the word is, a certain maturity about how they present themselves. So this image here just captures the moment, I think, in such profound way.
I just want to point out too that the Youth Council have broken no laws. So this confrontation is the product of the youth. The people that were breaking laws were the white counter protesters. So I think that's just a really important point. So this, I just want to point out, the marches took place within a generation of World War II, just about in 1967, 1968. So these young men and this adult here at the front, they're brandishing the swastika within a generation of World War II taking place. And again, this is who they're aiming their message at. This is the Youth Council. This is who, when they arrived on the streets of the South Side, this is what they provoked. There was a fair number of clergy who got involved. There were a fair number who didn't get involved as well. I think some of these images are so remarkable to see how they were facing this incredible battle and yet held on to joy. So I think that's something that I think that we've robbed this story of generations of school children in Milwaukee. But I think in a lot of ways, the fact that the Youth Council were able to persist in remarkable resistance would be such an important lesson for young people and over the last 50 years of Milwaukee to learn, and also not to have had that story, always centered around a white Catholic priest would be, incalculable how much value this story would have had over the last 50 years.
Might fit nice in a civics class, right?
It would make a great civics class. And I'm glad we get to share with you guys today. So these stories, one point that's made, this wasn't that long ago. All of the images that we shared that were in black and white, when you see images that are in color, it feels a little more present. As was pointed out, not only are some of these Youth Council members alive, some of them are good friends of Rob and I, or good colleagues of ours in this process, but so are the counter-protesters. The counter-protesters, this Black Power sign, it might be in someone's garage, but so are the Nazi swastikas. The marchers had a Black Santa to boycott businesses that were hostile to African Americans. In December of 1967, they used other tactics in addition to marching. This is the marchers on the day of the Ice Bowl. This guy in the fur coat is both cold and doing work, right? So this is a remarkable story of heroism, and actually of burning a lot of calories while fighting, much like the Packers did, much less heralded in our local civic narrative. This is a telegram from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Father James Grappi in support. He was a huge admirer of what was happening in Milwaukee. And in fact, from some of the stories I've heard from the Commando members, Martin Luther King looked at Milwaukee as an example for how to engage in aggressive, nonviolent direct action that was also integrated. So they marched for a total of 200 days. They ended their marches in the middle of March of 1968 to join Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, which was the next chapter he was attempting to write. And then literally within 2 weeks of that, he was assassinated in Memphis. There were reactions around the country, some of them violent, some of them nonviolent. Milwaukee saw some of, if not the largest, nonviolent protests in the wake of King's assassination, because Milwaukee had gotten really good at marching and organizing. This is an image that you may have seen before. This is kind of an iconic image of the commandos standing on the front lines of the marches with Father Grappi. And this is, I think, a more, maybe more illustrative image of what was actually happening. There were 15,000 people who marched that day in response to King's assassination, larger than the biggest showing of hatred, which I think is important. Does anybody know where this is? I think you all know where this is. What street? This is Wisconsin Avenue. This is right downtown. This is the Riverside Theater, Grand Avenue Mall. That subway is right here. Yeah, the new future home of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra. This is, until the more recent protests from Voces de la Frontera, the largest protest that Milwaukee and Wisconsin had ever, actually Act 10 probably were larger than this. But, you know, this is an image that is not in any place memorialized in our built environment. So to quell the frustrations of that resulted from Dr. King's assassination, in Senate, in Congress in Washington, D.C., they discussed Milwaukee, Wisconsin as they formed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is also known as the Fair Housing Act. And then Bell's bill, which was actually more stringent than that act, was passed just a few days later, or about a week later. So actually they won. Youth Council won. Bell's bill was passed. This actually was taken early in the marches. They didn't stop to celebrate. They moved on to what was next. One other piece of the coda that we'd like to share, this is images from exactly 50 years ago. This is the Chapman Hall takeover. There were students, Mexican students at UW Milwaukee, who deemed that school was not meeting any of their educational needs. There was no faculty staff. There were no resources that served them. So they actually occupied the chancellor's office until he heard their demands, and they occupied other parts of campus. And eventually, this is them looking for Spanish-speaking texts in the library and finding none. And eventually they won. So actually, a lot of the labor activists and Latino activists in Milwaukee of the 70s were really inspired by the Commandos and even joined forces with them in a protest against Alan Bradley, who had been discriminating against people of color in their hiring practices. Rob and I had the opportunity, actually really Rob deserves all the credit. 50 years after, the Neighborhood News Service published a thing called The Long March to Freedom, which was a collection of articles. The illustrator, Gabriela Rivero, is very talented. You know, she sort of foresaw maybe some of what was happening with the sign here of kind of the open housing and Black Lives Matter sign sort of transforming from one to the other. I know we only have a couple minutes here. If you are interested in further reading, it's a couple articles by Erica Metcalf, who's a remarkable scholar from Riverside High School and Howard University in UW Milwaukee. This one focused on the Youth Council, the Commandos, the wonderful Margaret Rosga. Peggy Rosga wrote the story on the open housing marches. And we just wanted to, actually, you know, this is now a little dated. We had as kind of our last image here, Voces de la Frontera. We could also could use marches from today. There's been about 70 days of marching now after George Floyd was killed. Also, Joel Acevedo is another important local case, which is very similar to the George Floyd cases in a lot of ways. But the legacy of protest continues. So, you know, with that, I would say my concluding thought is, I am oftentimes put in a position where people ask me to understand why Milwaukee is the way it is today. When I learned this story of the open housing marches, when you see 250 young people being encountered by young Black folks being encountered by a tidal wave of white hatred when they were simply advocating for their right to exist, I think, you know, that kind of racist, that is a demonstration of where Milwaukee was then. And to Amy's point, those people aren't gone, and I think the dynamics continue to live as well.
And let me also just say that over the last several months, we've seen somewhere between 7.5 to 14 million people take part in demonstrations across the country. And that is accounting for what has been now considered the largest social movement in U.S. history, and that matters in significant ways. We appreciate the time, folks.
Okay, so this is David Lubar, and Rob and Adam, thank you very much for sharing that history. You said it wasn't that long ago, and I agree, but we all need to be educated and to know that history much deeper than we do so that we can better appreciate and be better informed and more proactive to change the world today. And so thank you for what you're doing today to make Milwaukee a better place, to improve the lives of Black Africans and other minorities. It's very important. It's something that the GMC is committed to. And together we feel we can make important progress. So with that, this meeting is concluding. Our next meeting is September 14th. And thank you everyone for participating today.